and persevered through delayed flights and such. So, my name is Melissa Page Nichols, here in the Office of Campus Ministry at King's as pastoral counselor. I'm thrilled that you've joined us this evening. Really great to see some students joining us tonight as well. And I just want to warmly welcome you here. So I would like to now introduce, I will make one note that the donation box that you see out in the vestibule as you come in the doors for the theater, all of the monies collected continue to be going toward the Refugee Initiative Fund that we have here at King's, sponsoring folks to come here to Canada, of which we have several who have come already and several who are in queue to come soon. So, again, now I'd like to introduce Dr. Rob Ventresca, professor in the Department of History here at King's, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming, and as Melissa said, for braving the weather. Before introducing our distinguished guest, I want to offer a special word of thanks to the Center for Catholic Jewish Muslim Learning here at King's for its generous sponsorship of this evening's lecture. And I need also to offer a special word of thanks to Melissa Page Nichols from Campus Ministry for her time and logistical support in making this evening possible. So thank you, Melissa. Having had the privilege of working with our guest during a brief but intensive week of teaching and study in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2014, it's a great personal and professional honor for me to introduce to you Victoria Barnett. Dr. Barnett is director of the program on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She's a graduate of Indiana University, Union Theological Seminary in New York, and George Mason University. Her dissertation was a historical case study of the National Conference of Christians and Jews from 1933 to 1948. Dr. Barnett is widely recognized as one of the leading experts on the subject of the churches during the Holocaust. She's the author of critically acclaimed books, including For the Soul of the People, Protestant Protest Against Hitler, which was published in 1992 and tells the story of the confessing church and its complicated relationship with Nazism, as well as Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust, published in 1999, which offers a nuanced study of the complex range of historical and ethical questions raised by individual, institutional, and international responses to the Holocaust and genocide more generally. If you'll permit me a personal reflection, as my students and I learned a few weeks ago, and I see a few of them here in the audience, I've noted your presence. Just a few weeks ago, in fact, we were discussing some of Vicky's work in our class. Understanding the Holocaust necessarily entails grappling with historical, ethical, and moral religious questions. And I have to tell you that historians are not always comfortable with, nor are we equipped to do that in a particularly effective way, especially grappling, again, with ethical, moral, and religious dimensions of our study. But Victoria Barnett knows just how to do so, and she does it as well as anyone in the field. I think her work takes faith and religion seriously, grapples with them on their own terms, as it were, but always through a properly critical historical lens. In addition to her books, Dr. Barnett served as editor and translator of two seminal works, Wolfgang Gerlach's And the Witnesses Were Silent, The Confessing Church and the Jews. She also edited and translated the new revised edition of Eberhard Bethge's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a biography. From 2004 to 2014, Dr. Barnett served as one of the general editors of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works, the English language translation series of Bonhoeffer's complete works. It's a monumental achievement which no doubt will win for Bonhoeffer a justly deserved wider audience. In addition to all of this, of course, Dr. Barnett has written numerous articles and book chapters on the churches during the Holocaust. Needless to say, it truly is our privilege to have her here with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Victoria Barnett.
So does this light work?
No.
Oh, this should be fun. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank Melissa and Rob so much for the invitation to speak and for your hospitality. It's a pleasure to be here. Now we'll see how much of this I can make out in the, it's not dark. we'll do this. I'd like to start this evening's lecture with an interesting historical story that I came across in my research several years ago, and it's a surprising story. In February of 1935, a Reformed rabbi from Baltimore named Morris Lazarin took an indefinite paid leave from his congregation in Baltimore with the approval of his board, and he sailed to Europe, and he planned to move to Berlin and stay there. Lazarin was one of several American Jews who traveled to Germany in the early years of Nazism. Many of these trips were fact-finding trips and attempts to really begin humanitarian efforts to help the persecuted Jews in Germany. But Lazarin's trip was unique in several respects, because what he wanted to do was change what was happening in Nazi Germany on the grassroots level by bringing together German Jews and non-Jews to talk about their differences as a model of the interreligious work that he had been doing in the United States. Lazarin was the national Jewish staff member of the National Conference of Christians and Jews in the United States, an organization that had been founded in 1928, gained national prominence throughout the 1930s through its so-called trio tours and workshops and programs that brought together Catholics, Protestants, and Jews in the name of tolerance. This was the word that they used, and emphasized the values of a pluralistic democracy. The NCCJ was a success story in many ways, with a national profile and a nationwide level of influence. I don't know if people here, some of you might be old enough to remember the Tom Lehrer song, but they founded National Brotherhood Week. The NCCJ also founded what is today known as Religion News Service. They held interfaith events at the White House with FDR, and the organization was behind the Why We Fight newsreels during the Second World War, which featured Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant chaplains who talked about the moral importance of fighting Nazi Germany and Japan. The organization went from 2 part-time staffers in 1932 to a national staff of 275 people at 65 regional offices and a $2 million annual budget in 1949. The NCCJ also helped establish 325 local interreligious communities or committees around the United States. Their success was due partly to the savvy entrepreneurship of their director, the Reverend Everett Clinchy, and partly to the fact that they were able to seize a particular moment in U.S. history, one in which Catholics and Jews, who had reached a certain degree of integration into U.S. society, but remained deeply concerned about anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism, were willing to work with mainline Protestants to fight these evils. In return, mainline Protestants who were interested in so-called social gospel issues welcomed Catholic and Jewish allies for issues of shared concern. The NCCJ stayed away from theological dialogue, instead emphasizing the importance of social common ground. The NCCJ platform was that prejudice in all of its forms undermined the essential values of a democracy, and that Catholics, Jews, and Protestants needed to work together to fight such prejudice. Whatever their theological differences, they needed to present a united front on the issues. The only theological step they took early on, and for that era it was quite significant, was the repudiation of the evangelization and conversion of Jews to Christianity. And that perspective, interreligious work in the name of a broader pluralism and democratic values, was the lens through which they saw what was unfolding in Nazi Germany. The NCCJ believed that democracy was the antidote to prejudice. Everett Clinchy actually made 4 trips to Germany during the 1930s, and his initial interpretation of what was happening there was that it was an intergroup conflict, similar to tensions in the United States at the time between right-wing groups like the Ku Klux Klan and their targets. In other words, he did not see it as the persecution of the Jewish minority in a totalitarian state. United States Jewish leaders saw the situation in Nazi Germany differently from the very beginning. But before he went to Germany, Lazarin himself thought that the NCCJ approach that had succeeded in the United States in combating anti-Semitism might work in Germany. He wrote a German Jewish colleague, Max Warburg, a Hamburg banker who worked actively with American Jewish organizations in the early years of Nazism. He himself would flee in 1938. Lazarin wrote him shortly before he went to Germany, and I quote at some length from his letter to Warburg because it gives us a picture of his mindset. Quote, "The goal, of course, is clear. It is really the second emancipation of the Jews. Would it not be wise to have someone study all the legislation that has been enacted to date in reference to the Jews? What would be the steps to be taken if a different group gains control in Germany? What are the possible contingencies and who would be the possible leaders? Would it be easier if the present regime were overthrown to get across with the new leaders a simple decree declaring null and void the Aryan Clause and all the legislation? All these matters are going through my mind, and I believe the time is here to set in motion a study of the practical possibilities. What is done in Germany will have implications for the status of the Jew throughout the continent, particularly in Middle and Eastern Europe, and may decide his fate for many years. No more delicate task faces any Jew in the world today. The man who undertakes it must be persona grata with all groups. He must be able to envisage the Jewish situation in the general setting. He may not allow his Jewish feelings, no matter how keenly they may be involved, to distort the general picture. He certainly must know when to speak, to whom to speak, what to say, and how to say it. That is, of course, a large order, and I'm not at all sure I could do the job, but at least I would like to try." End of quote. Morris Lazarin arrived in Berlin in mid-February of 1935, and within days he was in a state of shock. The nature of his stay in Berlin changed dramatically. He had gone to Berlin on behalf of the NCCJ, but also on behalf of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And once Jews in Berlin heard that there was a rabbi from the United States, he was besieged by people who desperately hoped that they could get a U.S. visa. Including, by the way, a colleague of Karl Bonhoeffer, the father of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. One of the things I discovered in Lazarin's files was that he actually knew Bonhoeffer. This was a connection we hadn't known about. But he also consulted with Ambassador Dodd. He met secretly with German Jewish leaders. He had to be cautious in his letters from Germany, but on a short trip to Italy in April 1935, he wrote more openly. And his letters showed how his mind had changed. Quote, "It is utterly useless to attempt any liaison with the present regime. My work is clear: to stay as long as I can, absorb as much information as possible, and feed it to Christian as well as Jewish sources to keep the question alive." End of quote. And once he returned to the United States in June of 1935, he wrote U.S. Jewish leader Paul Beerwald, "No one who has seen what I've seen and heard what I've heard can ever be quite the same. It is a searing but sobering thing to go down into the abyss. Our people don't really know, deeply comprehend what this is all about, what is at stake. A malignant force has been let loose in the world against us." End of quote. The story of Lazarin's stay in Berlin is fascinating for many reasons, but I would note three very striking aspects. The first is that it's a reminder that people at the time, even good people, didn't see clearly what was happening in Nazi Germany unless they saw it firsthand. Morris Lazarin had to go to Berlin to realize the nature of what he was seeing and to realize that the situation in Nazi Germany was drastically different from what was happening in the United States. The second aspect is that when he got back to the United States, he received a very different hearing from his Christian colleagues within the interreligious movement than within the Jewish community. Once Morris Lazarin had experienced firsthand what German Jews were going through, he felt a personal sense of fear and vulnerability that his Christian colleagues in the NCCJ did not. Many of these U.S. Christian leaders, notably ecumenical and interreligious leaders, were decisive in their condemnation of what the Nazis were doing. So there was concern, but most of these reactions were within a much bigger framework. that was driven largely by domestic U.S. concerns at the time, and very much driven within the NCCJ by their approach that was characterized by mediation and finding common ground. And for that reason, over the course of the 1930s, many U.S. Jewish leaders came to dismiss the NCCJ because of what they perceived as its weakness on the issue of Nazism. Lazarin stayed involved, and he certainly continued to believe in its agenda in the United States, but his letters show with a deep sense of anguish about what was happening in Europe and a growing frustration with many of his colleagues. The third issue, which is why I begin my lecture this evening with his story, is that the story of Morris Lazarin and the larger issues that confronted the NCCJ tell us something, I think, about the nature of interreligious relationships and work, especially in times of great political turbulence and contention. And it's important to think about that in order to understand what the Holocaust might mean for a multi-religious audience, which is the focus of much of my work these days at the museum. Historically, there have essentially been two kinds of interreligious engagement, and they often draw different kinds of two distinct groups of people. We often think immediately of the first, which is theological, members of different faiths coming together to learn about each other and to learn from one another. Sometimes such conversations specifically address, what different people believe, how they practice, what their rituals are like. And in the case of the Jewish-Christian relationship historically, this has really addressed the long teachings of Christianity that targeted Jews for persecution and prejudice, and Christians in turn confronting their own teachings and rethinking some of those doctrines in the wake of the Holocaust. But the second kind of interreligious work is what defined the NCCJ, and it remains true of much interreligious work today. It's interreligious work as a platform for people to work together for the common good. It's coalition building, it's looking at what people have in common as opposed to differences, and as a result, it's often the case, as was the case in the NCCJ, that the theological concerns, but also sometimes the particular concerns of the respective groups, are set aside in the larger interests of the greater cause. These kinds of interreligious relationships can coexist, but as I said, they often involve different conversations and different issues, and for that reason, often different people. But in any kind of interreligious conversation, I think there are always several conversations always going on at once. There's the direct dialogue with the other. In one of the NCCJ's standard programs, the so-called trio tour modeled this by having a rabbi, a priest, and a Protestant clergyman travel throughout the United States and model a dialogue in which they spoke with one another about their shared interests and differences. Then there's a second conversation, which is kind of the background conversation that each dialogue partner is having perhaps in his or her own head or with their respective community. Morris Lazarin was in dialogue not only with his Christian colleagues in the NCCJ, but within his own Jewish community, within his synagogue. And the same was true for his Catholic and Protestant colleagues. And each community was always kind of pushing to bring its own priorities and its sensibilities and its opinions to bear on the interreligious conversations going on in the NCCJ. And thirdly, there was sort of the bigger global conversation in which they were engaged. In the case of the NCCJ, Nazi Germany was only one of several issues. And very often the different religious constituencies in the NCCJ came down on different sides. U.S. Catholics during the 1930s, for example, were focused completely on the Spanish Civil War. And they sided with the Spanish nationalists in that conflict, whereas most Jews and Protestants in the United States stood on the side of the Loyalists, the Republicans. And so you had this dividing line within the NCCJ that made, at times, the Catholic relationship with the Jews and Protestants very tense. After 1939, within American Protestantism, U.S. Protestants, especially in the mainline churches, became deeply divided over whether the United States should join the war against Nazi Germany. And this was an internal battle that was very difficult for the U.S. Jewish community to understand. So there was this interplay that was ongoing and constant within these three levels of dialogue, pushing the boundaries of conviction, sometimes leading to new alliances, sometimes leading to divisions. Such divisions can stall and sometimes even end interreligious dialogue. But this is the interaction that pushes the conversations forward and can eventually lead to actual change within a religious tradition. Nostra Aetate, the 1965 statement from Vatican II that led to a new phase in Catholic-Jewish relations, would not have happened without years of this kind of three-leveled conversation and interaction. The NCCJ was a success story in creating what could be described as a workable pluralism in the United States, what some scholars have called a tri-faith America. Yet as Will Herberg's classic 1955 book, Protestant Catholic Jew, illustrated, deep divisions remained. Because the process of interreligious dialogue reveals the built-in fault lines in interreligious work, issues of deep-seated contention and difference, different historical perspectives and experiences, and different vulnerabilities that lead to very different perspectives on a given situation, which shows why interreligious dialogue as often reveals differences as it does resolve them. Lazarin's experience in Nazi Germany, indeed the experience of U.S. Jews throughout the 1930s and 1940s, shows a painful tension between their genuine commitment to work on the big picture issues of interreligious understanding and their growing sense that their concerns about anti-Semitism and the persecution of their own community in Europe were not being taken seriously enough. So how are these issues, how is this history relevant to our understanding of the Holocaust and its possible implications for multi-religious, not just interreligious work today? In a sense, what I've been describing are the inevitable tensions that exist between addressing the particulars of an event and its more universal applications. The particulars of the Holocaust are the very deliberate targeting of a specific group, the Jews, with prejudice, violence, and finally mass murder on an almost incomprehensible scale. The universals, the bigger questions, if you will, are about the human capacity for evil, hatred, and violence against other human beings. Those bigger questions are not unique to the Holocaust. Every historical case of genocide raises them, even if the specific circumstances of each genocide may differ. The most effective interreligious work manages somehow to combine both sets of issues, their universals and the particulars. The persecution of any minority raises questions not just about the attitudes toward that particular group, but larger questions about how we frame our lives together in civil society, globally, and how we prevent such violence from defining us and from spreading. When you bring together people of different traditions to address these questions, it creates a different kind of conversation and a different perspective from which one can explore and understand a history such as the Holocaust. The division between the two kinds of interreligious relationships has certainly been true of the post-Holocaust trajectory of interreligious dialogue. There is today a large and significant body of literature on the Christian-Jewish relationship before and after the Holocaust that addresses the theological foundations and implications, the Christian teachings of contempt against Judaism, the many centuries of persecution against the Jews, and the manifold ways in which Christians were responsible for the suffering of Jews before and during the Holocaust. Post-Holocaust dialogue has been largely a theologically driven project and fits within the first category of interreligious work I described, a theological conversation that in this case between Christians and Jews has led to greater understanding, reconciliation, respect, and actual changes within the Christian tradition, in this case in Christian teachings about Judaism. The church leaders, theologians, educators, and others who engaged in this work and developed this new theological approach are a distinct body of people. In the United States today, for example, there are several dozen centers on Christian-Jewish dialogue, as well as numerous groups of people who are involved in sort of broader Abrahamic dialogues between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. As our societies become more diverse and new issues come on the table, many of these interfaith centers are expanding, not just to include Muslims, but other faith communities as well. The second trajectory that came out of the Holocaust focused less on the dialogical and more, I would say, on these universal lessons of the Holocaust. This is where one might locate so-called political theologians, such as the late German theologian Dorothee Sölle. And many of the ecumenical and interdenominational organizations after 1945 followed this direction as well. And in a sense, this is what the NCCJ was all about even in the 1930s. So people after 1945 who were following this trajectory were trying to look at the Holocaust in a way that went beyond the particulars and looked at more universal dilemmas, the human propensity for violence and evil, the ways in which we dehumanize other human beings, and the systemic and political issues that inevitably emerge when we reach this level of analysis. Study and discussion of these issues may help us to see the broader patterns in the particulars of an event, because it is actually on this level that you can have people from very different groups, faiths, and nationalities begin to acknowledge the particularities. They come through the open door of the bigger questions, but they find themselves looking at a very specific history of the persecution of the Jews. Over the years, I've worked with many international groups at the Holocaust Museum, for example, and I found again and again that they come in through that larger door, but when they go through our exhibition and look at the actual history of what happened in Europe, they may suddenly, for the first time, understand the significance of what happened to the Jews of Europe, and maybe even for the first time, begin to think about the issue of anti-Semitism. But as Morris Lazarin discovered, it can also be the case when people go through that broader door that specific concerns are brushed aside. The inherent danger is to rush to the universals, human inhumanity against our neighbors, because quite frankly, that's an easier place to be, and it's also the place where you can immediately begin to build bridges. But that can also too easily become a place where victims may be turned into symbols of something bigger, and the particular history of their victimization and the prejudices against them quickly get brushed aside or minimized and in a way dehistoricized. Morris Lazarin, when he returned to the United States, found that many of his Catholic colleagues, for example, were willing to talk about anti-Semitism only if anti-Catholicism got equal time. And the NCCJ in its pamphlets about Nazi Germany always framed the issues that way because they wanted to do justice to all sides. And yet in this period of the 1930s, as the persecution of the Jews in Europe was mounting, the Jewish community in the United States felt deeply that their concerns were being brushed over. So the goal, I think, is a process or relationship that finds some kind of balance between the particulars of what is happening to a certain group and the universal questions, not distorting the one in the quest for the other, a process in which the multiple levels of the interreligious conversation can perhaps even be correctives for one another. So is it even possible to understand the Holocaust multireligiously? And if so, what does that look like? Let me answer by going back to another story, based on more recent research. In recent years, the Holocaust Museum has acquired a great deal of archival material from North Africa, especially Morocco and Tunisia, which is giving historians a more detailed picture of the occupation in those countries, as well as an up-close glimpse of the relationships that existed between Jews and Muslims in those countries at the time. We also have the International Tracing Service records of the Red Cross, which after 1945 acquired all the documentation that had been maintained by the Nazis on all levels, from Gestapo and police records in German towns to records in DP camps after 1945. These records also reveal the diversity that existed in Europe before the Holocaust and the diversity of people who became victims of Nazi expansion and brutality. For example, we find histories of Polish towns in which Muslim Tatars and Polish Jews had lived together side by side before 1933. We find stories of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others who become prisoners in the Nazi camp system. and stories of relationship between different religious communities that led both to rescue in some cases and in other cases to collaboration with the Nazis. The new research is revealing all these new complicated histories and stories. And in my work with multi-religious groups, I'm finding that this new historiography is helping them connect differently to the history of the Holocaust, not just through the universal issues, but through the particulars first of their group and then looking at what happens to the Jews in the story. So I'll conclude with a new story, scholarship that is currently being done by a Moroccan-born anthropology professor named Omar Boum, who now teaches at UCLA. He was a visiting fellow at the museum several years ago, where he did a great deal of research in our North African collection. And he published a book based on this research called Memories of Absence, Muslims Remember Jews in Morocco. His current research is also based on material he found in museum archives about the International League Against Anti-Semitism, which had been founded in the 1920s by a French Jew named Bernard Lacache, the son of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants to France. Lacache founded this organization to raise awareness about the issue of anti-Semitism in France and to organize Jews and non-Jews together to combat racial and ethnic discrimination more broadly, somewhat like what the NCCJ was trying to do in this country. In the early 1930s, he became quite concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in the French Algerian press and other parts of North Africa, and growing incidents of violence against Jews in those countries. And so LICA, this League to Fight Anti-Semitism, established offices in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and began to reach out to Muslims throughout the region who were concerned about the rise in Arab nationalism and attacks on Jews throughout the region. In 1937, an Egyptian writer, Hamid al-Maliji, published a pamphlet warning Muslims in those countries against the racist ideology of National Socialism. He wrote that while Muslims might think that they shared common cause with the Nazis in their fight against Jews, and the Nazis were trying to sell this to some of those communities, al-Maliji wrote, the fundamental racism of National Socialism meant that they would inevitably target Muslims as well. Furthermore, he said, Nazi ideology was inherently anti-Islamic. One of the more stunning documents that Omar Boum found in our archives was a 52 translation into Arabic of excerpts from Mein Kampf, that were published in 1939 by a Muslim journalist in Algeria, consisting of material that had been omitted in the official Nazi Arabic translations of the document. Sections in which Hitler had written, for example, that Arabs were inferior barbarians who lacked culture and civilization. The pamphlet actually included a startling drawing of Hitler and Mussolini trampling on a copy of the Quran. Al-Maliji in his pamphlet included a bibliography of other German works on race and Aryan supremacy that had been translated into Arabic. When the Germans occupied Paris in 1940, the Gestapo closed the League's office, and Lacache fled to Algiers, where he began to seek allies throughout North Africa in his work and became very active in building alliances between Muslims and Jews there. In many respects, the League's work during these years was similar to the approach that had been taken by the NCCJ, including its message that any kind of prejudice might begin with one group of victims, but inevitably it will begin to touch other groups as well. The League tried to build alliances that focused on the larger issues of economic and political integration, and it portrayed anti-Semitism as a threat to the very fabric of society. To some extent, they succeeded in building these alliances. Some of those alliances continued into the 1950s. In many ways, however, and for various reasons, there were constant pressures that made these alliances in North Africa difficult. Maurice Lazarin was a religious leader. Bernard Lacache, Hamid al-Maliji, and Abderrahman Fitravi, this other journalist, were not. And yet they were trying to build religious bridges between North African Arabs or Muslims and the Jews there. And it should be noted that they viewed the threat of National Socialism from a very similar perspective to that of Morris Lazarin and the NCCJ. They saw it through the lens of the importance of civil liberties and human rights. And they realized that it was necessary for religious communities to work together to oppose National Socialism because it was such a danger to their society. As the Muslims in this story looked into their own tradition, they began to articulate a critique of Nazism based on Muslim principles, just as some of the Christians in the NCCJ began to argue that Nazism was inherently anti-Christian. As I said, this is new research, but I think it's very important as we begin to arrive at a more accurate picture of the scope of the religious responses to the Holocaust. When I first got into the field, we were looking at the German churches, the Vatican, the easily identifiable religious institutions in this history, but the deeper we go into the history and the more the scholarship begins to extend beyond Europe, we begin to see all these other different religious players that are doing very interesting things. And as a result, the field of Holocaust studies is changing. Today, the Holocaust is often being taught in courses on contemporary genocide and other fields that are approaching the history through that larger lens. But it's the particulars of the history, whether they're the familiar ones or the newer ones, the work of Lazarin and the NCCJ, the work of Lakash and the League, of people like Maligi, that enable us to get a different picture through that larger lens. The tension between the universal and the particular is not just a characteristic of interreligious dialogue. I think it's a necessary and fruitful aspect of academic work in general. In my work at the museum, I've discovered that when I look at this history together with very diverse audiences, we quickly get into a different kind of conversation. Increasingly, I'm working with young interreligious groups. They include not only Muslims, Christians, and Jews, but sometimes Sikhs, Baha'is, sometimes the so-called nuns, people of no faith. And it's an interesting mix of people to look at this history together and raise different kinds of questions. Because the way in which members of different religious groups make a relationship to the persecution of a religious minority such as the Jews in Europe is a step to understanding what it truly means to be a citizen of a society, of what it means to engage in civil society as a member of a faith community, of what it means to stand together with others against hatred. It really is the place where the particulars of the history and the universals can converge. And it can be a place where if people are willing to put together certain presuppositions or existing tensions, they may find a conversation that opens the way to a deeper understanding, not just of the persecution and murders of millions of European Jews, but of their own burning concerns from today. In terms of the issues that confront us today, I think this aspect of Holocaust history is worth a great deal of reflection, especially if we invoke the Holocaust or seek to learn from it as we address the challenges we face today. Thank you. I would be happy to take questions.
There's microphones. Sorry, just ran into that one. On the side here and in the middle aisle for questions.
Or we can all go home. No.
Let the gentleman go first.
Yeah, you mentioned the Vatican and its part in Germany. And again, I was raised as a ignorant, prejudicial Irish Roman Catholic. And we didn't have much to do with Jews nor Muslims. We had more to do with Protestants, and that there was no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And it was that prejudice that drove me out of my own home and eventually study religion and become a priest. But then when we never talked about the Holocaust when I was in the seminary. Never. And yet the Catholic Church, under Pope Pius XII and Pius XI, and Pope Pius XII was the nuncio in Germany, and he had signed a concordat with Hitler that basically, you keep your nose out of our business, meaning politics, and we will keep your nose out of your business, meaning religion. And to a certain extent, from what I've read about it, basically Pope Pius XII's hands were tied. He couldn't do anything, but yet I did learn after that he did, behind the scenes, that the Catholic Church was there was about 20 million Catholics living in Germany at that time, right? Yeah. And he was instrumental in saving 700,000 lives. That's what I've read. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that Hitler was able to put his finger on that whole thing about our religious drive, and he was able to manipulate it, to the point that he said, like, I was well trained by the Jesuits. He said, I learned well.
I don't know if he said that.
I have the quote here.
Well, no,
but anyway, what I'm wondering at, you mentioned the Vatican. Mm-hmm. What was your perspective in the sense of Pope Pius's lack of involvement in helping to ease the
right.
Holocaust?
Thank you. Yeah, well, of course, I'm standing here in front of one of the authorities, Professor Ventresca, who's written a wonderful book about this. So I would say two things. And the first I would say is that, there is still so much more we need to learn about the role of the Vatican. The Vatican archives have been released up to 1939, but the crucial years, the wartime years after 1939, have not yet been released for scholars. And so I think many historians are cautious about drawing definitive conclusions until those archives can really be researched. And the museum is one of the institutions that has been calling for years for the full opening of the archives to scholars so that people can really... That being said, I'm an expert on the Protestant churches, and from spending a lot of time in Protestant archives, I suspect that even once the Vatican archives are open, it's not going to answer all the questions. But I think one can say several things about religious leaders in general, not just the Pope, but Lutheran bishops in Germany, Protestant leaders in other places, but especially within Germany, that there really was a certain amount or a great deal of caution on the part of both the Protestant and Catholic churches with respect to the regime, in part because you had forces within the church that liked a lot of the things that the Nazis were doing. It must be said that the anti-Semitism was not a stumbling block for most of them. And they were fearful that the regime might really begin to interfere in the churches. So, we can look at the historical complexities of why church leaders were navigating these stormy waters the way they were. One can sort of have that stand there as a historian and at the same time say, but if they had spoken out, or if they had really aggressively stood in solidarity with the Jews, this might have been different. I mean, I think one can sort of make a moral judgment on the failure and understand the complexities of what they found themselves into. And so that, as a historian of the Protestant churches, that's kind of how I look at that. So the whole question of, as I said, Professor Ventresca's book is on the topic is very helpful because he really goes into a lot of the larger complexities in Catholicism. But there's much more to learn. Yes, sir.
Hi. You mentioned interreligious meetings at the White House, and you've briefly mentioned people of non-faith. I'm wondering what the role of people of non-faith in interreligious conversations is.
Was historically or is today?
Well, both, actually.
Well, so I don't really know the answer historically because when you're looking at an organization like the NCCJ, I mean, these people are all very firmly coming from a certain faith direction. So I mean, it would be interesting to really dig and see if there are other groups that pop up where there's something similar to the people who are not affiliated with religion today. One of the interesting things today, I work a lot with professors who teach in Christian seminaries, theological seminaries, as well as people teaching in religious studies. And a number of students, even students going to seminaries, are not affiliated or consider themselves agnostic, but they're interested in these questions. There was a wonderful blog that was going on for a couple of years. I think he's stopped doing it, and I'm spacing out on the name, but maybe somebody knows. It was called Fatheist. Are you familiar with? If you Google it, Fatheist, you'll come up with the name, and maybe I'll think of the name. This was a student, I think, at Harvard a couple of years ago, who's an atheist, but really interested in sort of the faith questions. And it was a brilliant blog. It was fascinating to read because he was really kind of engaging as somebody who doesn't believe in God, but engaging in conversation with people who did. And one of the groups that I bring every year to the museum is a group of young graduate students who are really interested in interreligious issues called State of Formation, which comes out of the Andover Newton Hebrew College Consortium in Boston. Has a fund, I think they've got funding from the Luce Foundation. But again, so State of Formation are people really interested in these questions. Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, people who are not anything, they're just interested. So I think that this is maybe something new. This certainly wasn't the case with the NCCJ. And it was a different era, but that today you really have sort of a multi-religious dialogue that includes people of no faith, but they're really interested in the issues.
Well, a second part of the question then would be, would you consider, if these meetings were taking place in the White House, would the state be maybe a secular voice in that interreligious conversation?
So what the NCCJ did with Roosevelt was photo ops to promote their cause. Clinchy, the man I mentioned, was really good at giving this organization a high profile. Like he said, he founded things like National Brotherhood Week. And so National Brotherhood Week, you had priests, rabbis, and Protestant clergymen going to the White House, standing with Roosevelt to show that American democracy was pluralistic. And if you think of the prejudices at the time, the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s in the United States really gathered steam. And one of the things that happened in the United States after 1933 is that there was a tremendous rise in hate groups, some of them modeled after the fascist and Nazi groups in Europe. They saw what was happening there, and so you had hate groups in the United States. And this was in part something to counter that, where the President of the United States, with leaders of faith, was saying, this is not what we're about. Would that we had similar scenes today, but I digress. So it was, it wasn't the White House being religious. It was, I think, more of a photo op where they were trying to make a certain statement that at the time was very important.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm really curious to know more about the stories of other religious groups that were impacted by the Nazis, and specifically the ways that they were involved in forms of resistance.
Yeah. This is new research that is just getting started. So I don't know much more than what I'm reading by other people. I think Omar Boom's work is really interesting in that regard, looking at countries in North Africa, and especially the role of this league. I don't know much more than that. This is, like I said, this is something we're really starting to get into. And the tracing service records I mentioned, I'm not the authority on that. One of my colleagues really has begun to search this database. It's absolutely huge because it includes every single individual who was swept up in the Nazi system. But when she first started searching, I said, do a search for different religious groups and see what you come up with. And all of a sudden we were pulling up, Coptic Christians from Egypt. It was really kind of amazing, the people who, become, now some of them are, right after 1945, after the war is over, they find themselves in a displaced person camp for other reasons. So, some of it is that. But some of it are people who apparently were involved in some kind of resistance. And so, we're just beginning to dig at these stories. Yes?
You mentioned the more secular objections to the Holocaust and the Germans attacking the Jews. Albert Camus said that Simone Weiss was the only one in Europe who seemed to realize what was going on. And I read an essay she wrote before the worst happened. And the picture in Germany, they were hungry, they were going jobless, people were starving.
Yeah.
But she also noted the lack of, their morale was just gone.
Yeah, yeah.
The moral vacuum, and how desperate they were. And when you consider, you probably know, I can't remember the small percentage by which Hitler got in.
Yeah,
But
well,
and then, of course, once he got in, his
Right.
own particular insane prejudices took over. But so much of it was not religious. But once he gets the iron fist, he can direct the machinery of the state toward this sort of thing. And it's frightening when you see all these economic and social and sapping people's moral will. How do you prevent a scapegoat from being attacked? You know.
I wish I knew the answer to that. But I think you're right. And the statement by Camus, you do find individuals in Nazi Germany who give early, really compelling accounts, sort of eyewitness accounts of what's happening. And that's one of the things that made Lazarin's letters so striking to me, is he kind of goes over thinking he's going to, build goodwill. And he gets over there and he realizes this is a completely different, thing that is going on there, and just becomes tremendously disheartened. But the question by which one prevents people from being scapegoated, I mean, that's one of the things, Professor Ventresca mentioned my book on bystanders, that really kind of moved me to write that book, because one of the big questions for me is, all these people who saw what was going on, what were they thinking? Why didn't they do something? And unfortunately, the historical research that has been done in the past 10 years shows the extent to which people not only saw what was going on, but really participated in it or benefited from it. So we're beginning to understand the dynamics of life in Nazi Germany, even in an even darker way, if that was even possible, but in terms of people joining in the scapegoating of others. And that's what makes the people who withstand that so amazing. The studies that have been done on rescuers are interesting because no profile emerges. These are the different factors that lead somebody to be a resistor or rescuer. But they really do show that people can find the words and to speak their conscience if they have the courage to do so.
So you mentioned that one of the questions of multi-religious dialogue about the Holocaust is the human capacity for evil. Yeah. You didn't mention the question of where was God in this, and is that a question they address too, or is
It is.
Okay?
Well, yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. I would say that was, if you look at the early decades of Jewish-Christian dialogue and conversations about the Holocaust, this is a big question that comes up. I find it's not so much in the literature anymore. And that in itself may be an interesting observation in terms of how people think about God. Or maybe the fact that, scholars move increasingly toward looking at what it is in people that make them behave. I mean, that the blame falls on humanity, not on God. But that was certainly an element, especially I would say in some of the early Jewish reflections, Fackenheim, Arthur Cohen, people were, Elie Wiesel, people were really struggling with this question, and Christians were addressing it as well.
Certainly back in the period of World War II, the world communicated and interacted very differently. Yeah. When you look at the nature of contemporary communication and dialogue through social media and other very decentralized ways of disseminating information, what do you see as the opportunities and the challenges of maintaining that dialogue that's necessary?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question. And, you know, I think this is partly generational. We were talking right before my talk about Twitter. I have a Twitter account at the museum, which they gave me, and I've used it like 16 times. And every time I use it, I have to get somebody younger to say, now, what do I do? You know, among my children, my kids' generation, you know, I think that there's an instinctive way to use this in a very productive fashion. I think it's a good thing. I mean, the State Affirmation group that I mentioned, who comes to the museum every year, they all blog, they all tweet, and you know they'll send me what they write, and it's really wonderful. And sometimes, as they're going through the museum, they'll be sort of giving spontaneous reactions, and people will be answering them, and the conversation will be building. The museum website, we get, I think somebody told me, 18 million hits a year on our website, and about 40% of those are they're international. Our website, large portions of our website are translated into 15 different languages, including Arabic, Farsi, Baha, Indonesian, and we get a lot of hits from those places. And we have a couple of people on the museum staff who speak those languages, so they kind of see the conversations going on there. So there's a lot of potential. It's not the same as when you have people in a room talking with each other, and it's not the same as when you have a community where there are real relationships and people are working through things together. And it seems to me that the real, you know, the most productive kinds of interreligious work are the ones we don't know about because they're happening locally. I was saying at dinner this evening that just last week I met at the museum with the imam from Marseille in France, a rabbi from Bordeaux, and the director of one of the camp commemoration sites in France. And they were actually telling me wonderful things about what they were doing in France between the French community and the Muslim community. And you know, I don't see this on CNN, but it was certainly nice to hear about this because that's where the action needs to happen, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we're winding up.
Just want to offer a word of thanks to Victoria. I think this is incredibly timely, considering current issues around religious extremism. I know that Victoria was just at a conference before coming here in which she was part of a panel that was addressing this overarching issue of religious extremism. And so thinking about the great importance of not only but multi-religious dialogue, respect, and understanding to recognize our shared humanity and to resist prejudice and oppression. The reminder that if we stay in a place of the universals of human cruelty and dehumanization, that might be more comfortable, but then as a result, we might very much avoid the particulars of the personal experience. And so I appreciated being called to a balance of those two related and not binary things. And then, again, illuminating the other religious communities that were also impacted by the Nazis, the stories that have been omitted, that have not been storied. And I guess lastly, just to offer thanks as well, Victoria, for in all of the things that you shared, I think it brings together a term that kept going through my head as you were speaking from the Bantu dialect. Some of you may have heard of it, but the term Ubuntu, that I am because we are, so that we are inextricably connected. And I thank you for reminding us of these things tonight. Thank you. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Safe travels home.
Thank you. Oh, thanks.